Good morning. This is Dr. Iftikhar Ahmed Ansari, Department of Political Science, Aligarh Muslim University. Now, today I'm going to talk about normative method in political science. So, we have come to the topic which is talking about the methods in political science and in that normative method. So, before talking about normative itself, let's try to understand what methods mean in political science. So the term method is gotten from the Greek methodos, that is road to, that is reaching somewhere. So henceforth, uh, etymologically, the term alludes to the method of accomplishing something, the arrangement of strategy to get or arrive at the end expected. So a technique is a method of examining for showing up at a specific outcome. It has been very much said what the magnifying instrument is to science or the telescope to strategize, a logical technique or method is to the sociologists. So various techniques have been proposed by researchers for the logical examination of political wonders. So broadly categorizing these techniques and methods as normative and empirical method. So normative method that we are going to talk about here, it categorizes or it seeks to determine and prescribe values, aims at making normative statements. Now, normative statements which are concerned with what ought to be or should be. Now, it tend to express preference for a particular type of order as dictated by a sense of duty or some universal need or by commitment to a moral principle or ideal. While strong arguments may be advanced in support of a normative statement, it is not capable of being discovered, described, or verified by our sense experience. On the other hand, empirical method, it seeks to discover and describe. It aims at making an empirical statement which is concerned with is, that is what is. An empirical statement is concerned with the situation which can be observed by our sense experience, which can be verified by repeated observation and whose accuracy can be tested. So what is normative? So while empirical in contrast is concerned with what is, normative political theory is concerned with what ought to be. So in other words, normative political theory is concerned about how the world should be. It focuses on the exploration of values and what should be done based upon those values. Now, the central question of normative ethics is determining how basic moral standards are arrived at and justified. Normative political science considers an endless array of questions like what is a good citizen? Do human rights exist? And if so, what are they? Who should rule? What purpose should government serve? And is there any ideal constitution? If so, what it is? What is social justice? I mean, these are the questions which are normative in nature. It cannot be answered by presenting evidence alone. There is no test that would prove beyond a reasonable doubt what a good citizen is or that any constitution is in fact ideal. So, normative political science typically or normative method typically proceeds primarily by appealing to logic and reason. Now, when we talk about normative method, the theorists have tried to answer questions like what is a good citizen in three main ways. Now, focusing on the consequence of a behavior, the moral values or moral rules and or the virtue itself. That is, it is either teleological or consequential or deontological. I mean, the behavior itself is based on what will the consequences, that is consequential, teleological, or what is deontological, that is its moral virtue or moral rootings. So the nature of political theorizing is both descriptive, that is Aristotle's Constitution of Athens, which he categorized, and it could be prescriptive, like Plato's Republic, the Law, or Aristotle's Politics itself that he wrote. So politics has a teleological character, and as an activity, it is concerned with a telos, that is the primarily defined as the good life of the political community. So, a normative method provides a value based view about what the society or what the social world ought to be like, or how it ought to work. So, it proposes goals and standards that should be achieved or at least are desirable if they cannot be achieved at the moment. So, deductive reasoning method of moving from journal to particular, or inductive reasoning method moving from particular to journal, can be used to arrive at such results. Now, when we talk about the central idea of normative method, the central idea is to study politics and analyze the state, the functioning of state, and view it in the light of what ought to be rather than what they are. So the normativeness wants to give preference to should and ought to be. It wants the realization of certain universal values, norms, principles through the machinery of state. So instead of asking how social policy decisions have come to be made, it asks instead how they ought to be made. Now, in such studies, the aim is to examine a set of political principles and detail their logical characteristics and explore their implications for social policy. At least in broad institutional term, it is assumed by some that since normative principles relate to what should be or what ought to be, the principles can easily be ignored. But the great adherents of this approach, they declare unambiguously that norms or principles are not to be ignored, but they are to be implemented. So normative method should be a reflection on practice, not a means of ignoring it. Thus, we can say that values, principles, and eternal ideas relating to politics or function of a state, they constitute the central idea of normative approach or normative method to the study of politics. In other words, this method says that norms and principles are to be allowed in practice or followed in practice, and the aim of such norms is to make the political organization acceptable to all or majority of people. Now, when we talk about the components of normative method, there is an emphasis on what is good or what is not good. It says that when a policymaker proceeds to formulate a policy or adopt a decision, he must see that to what extent the policy decision will produce the desired results. The concept of goodness is linked with expectation. So the members of political organization, they want to fulfill their manifold desires and they expect that the authorities shall act accordingly. It may be that the expectations do not always tally the real results, but that does not matter. The expectations fall in the category of ought to be. So, good also refers to attainment of welfare objectives of the state. So, the term good starts to scan the policy, decisions, and functions of authority. So, the normative method establishes the concept of responsibility. If certain norms and principles are put forward, and if they are more binding on the authority, people can judge the success or failure of authority. In other words, norms are easy to locating the responsibility. So, normative method stipulates that norms and principles are of immense value and importance so far as the determination of policy and the decision and their implementation are concerned. Is or what is happening are important, no doubt, but every authority must follow these norms and ideals. So, normative method envisages of striking a balance or equilibrium between what is and what happens or what ought to be or should be. So, any biasness will invariably plague the proper functioning of the state as well as decision-making process. So, an authority aiming at the attainment of general welfare objective cannot take the side of neglecting this ought or normative part. The balancing process is not a stable one, it's always in an unstable condition. It moves from one stage to another. So, normative method never thinks of anything settled. Though it is generally argued that norms and values and principles are of eternal in nature, But scholars are of opinion that the world eternal need not be taken that seriously. Now, moving further, talking about normative questions itself. So, normative question is concerned with norms and normative principle. A normative principle can be defined as a general directive that tells agents what they ought or ought not to do. So, when questions like how resources should be distributed within society, or how political power should be allocated, or what rights and duties of citizens are argued, we can making use of normative concepts such as justice, equality, freedom, right, democracy, and authority. They are normative in the sense they seek to specify what we ought to do rather than simply describing how political life works. So our answer to such questions, they differ from other, and our conclusion drawn may also not match some. Now, since these are subjective in nature, it differs from one person to another. Now, value-based is the another criteria of a normative method. Now, such subjective value judgments may not just be different, but they may be completely wrong as well. For example, if you find voting for a politician who claims to believe in social justice and equality of opportunity, but later discover that his understanding of those words, social justice and equality of opportunity, are opposite to what you understand, entirely different from yours. Now, you may consider those words as just opinion and decide not to listen to that politician any further. So, the conclusion drawn about the meaning of the concept is problematic. For normative questions are value-based, which differ from good normative question to bad, as unity is forged and progress made on the strength of the normative beliefs. Sorting inconsistent point of normative argument by analytical technique becomes important. Now, talking about analytical technique and the tradition which is being followed in normative method, that we find that the analytical tradition of political theory in particular, it share a commitment to presenting arguments, deploying those concepts with clarity, precision, and economy, and to carefully demonstrating what we ought to favor, one interpretation of the meaning and implication of giving political concepts over those defended by other scholars, or indeed could be the politicians. So the analytical mode of political argument focused, as does much political theory, on careful conceptual clarification, on drawing of fine distinction and the presentation of detailed objections to the work of others. So normative basically talks about ideal and feasibility. Now we should first work out what the right principles would be to regulate a society, for example, which is in some sense idealized. For instance, we might ask what the right rule would be to govern a society in which people could be relied upon to follow them. Now, answering that question gives us our ideal theory of justice as promoted and presented by Rawls in 1971. He developed that normative mechanism as well and presented how to arrive at that ideal or ought to kind of a value-based judgment. So once we have that theory clear, we can investigate what we should do once we drop the idealizing assumption about the behavior and assume instead that people will comply with our chosen rules only imperfectly. That is a principle which we are unlikely to abide by over time must, for Rawls, be rejected even at the level of ideal theory as far as feasibility is concerned. Then let's go on further to see how to make this theoretically possible. Rawls here suggests two tests for a theory of justice or to arrive at some ideal kind of a situation. So passing either, he believes, would give us a greater ground for confidence about any theory or credentials. So the first test asks whether a given theory is capable of generating what Rawls called reflective equilibrium. So when thinking about the nature of justice or ideal situation, we must begin with some reasonably confident view about particular cases of justice or injustice. Now, what Rawls called considered moral judgments. So, we can then test rival political and moral theories according to whether that squares with those judgments, and if necessary, reject them if they fail. Now, the process can also work the other way, as theories which appear illuminating in general persuade us to abandon or revise some of our considered judgment about particular cases. Now, in this process of mutual adjustment, our theory of justice or our theory of ideal situation, our considered judgment increasingly comes to square with each other. So, a theory which is fully compatible with our considered judgment, which appears to deliver the right judgment in the right cases, might be said to have attained a state of reflective equilibrium that Rawls was talking about. So, this method may give coherence to a proposition, but the question of objectivity remains here. Now, the idea may become coherent as an idea, but whether it is unbiased, whether it is objective, now that needs to be investigated. That's the second test. So, how to bring objectivity in a proposition or to remove the biasness? So, one of the most familiar criticisms made of the political arguments presented in public life is that they are self-serving. Some of the ideas proposed by ideal situation, proposed by others, might be blamed to be serving their own interest. So, Rawls' second test for the theory of this justice suggests how it can avoid this criticism. Rather than simply asking us which principle of justice we are prepared to defend, he asks us to imagine ourselves choosing between principles behind a wheel of ignorance. Now, wheel of ignorance, that is a situation in which we did not even know the basic facts about ourselves. What our understanding, what we are, our capabilities, our talent, or our likes and dislikes, we do not know. We need to imagine that situation. Now, such as our social class or the nature of our talent, we do not know which class we belong to, what talents we inherit or we have. Now, thinking about justice within such an original position, as Rawls called it, might have a dramatic effect on our reasoning itself. A rational person would probably select a principles which would insulate the citizens from excessive economic inequality. After all, if he condoned too much of inequality, he might turn out to be a receiving end of it in the real life. If he came from a working class family, say, or if he had few marketable talents. Likewise, not knowing whether you might in fact be deeply religious or you have religious commitment, a rational person would opt for principle ensuring freedom of worship. So, broadly speaking, that some theories would fail to be agreed upon in such a hypothetical choice situation, and the others would survive this test. So, the theory or the idea, the ought to situation or ought to idea, normative idea, which survives this test of objectivity or biasness, that is the second test which makes an idea fully normative and acceptable. So, in a nutshell, a sound argument should first be capable of fitting together into broad theory of any ideal situation. For example, the theory of justice, if we talk about, which Rawls gave, and of illuminating our considered judgment, that is, it should be capable of attaining a state of reflective equilibrium, and it should, in second step, be capable of emerging under a hypothetical decision process which models a kind of impartiality. So, Rawls believed that his own theory of justice, with principles guaranteeing all citizens a bundle of equal basic liberties and rejecting inequalities which were not compatible with fair equality of opportunity and which were not in the interest of the worst off, was capable of passing such test. It's incapable of passing such test, which is not in the interest of worse off or those who are marginalized section. So, nevertheless, normative theory should attain that status where one can start making such judgments which are value-based and also acceptable following these two tests. So, normative theory should retain its prescriptive, justificatory, evaluative aspect as valuable in themselves, no matter what its practical side might be. So, what we have to remember here is the two tests which a decision maker or the one who is following the normative method should follow. Once these two methods are followed appropriately, then surely a situation comes where normative methods will not be reprehensible to most of the behavioralists who believe in finding solution through empirical methods. So that will bring objectivity also and will become acceptable to others. I hope the normative method must have been clear to all. Thank you.